Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am so happy to be back with you. We have had some scheduling snafus of late, and so I have not had an episode. I didn't even go back and listen to see who I said was the author for this episode because there's just been a lot of rescheduling happening, which is fine. These things happen. It's kind of partially the time of year, partially a lot of unforeseen circumstances. But several authors have needed to reschedule. So they're coming up in the rotation, just not quite when I expect them to initially. Not a problem. I hope you had a great week. A great couple of weeks, actually. It is that time of year here in Portugal where it's colder inside than it is outside. It's 65 degrees right now with about, I forgot to look, but it's anywhere from 95 to 98% humidity. It's very damp this time of year. And houses are made to keep heat out during the summer. So in the winter, it's often colder inside than it is outside. If I go outside and stand in the sun, it's great. Inside my office, it's my fingers are cold and I'm wearing a sweatshirt. 65 degrees in December. Nothing to sneeze at. Don't get me wrong. It's beautiful. We went for a walk the other day. We bring the dogs to the office and we like to take them for a walk at lunchtime just for them to get out and get some exercise and go use the bathroom, and for us to get out and soak up some sunshine. And I took my sweater off and was just walking in a tank top. It was that nice. So I really cannot complain, even though it sometimes seems ridiculously cold inside. But yeah, it is what it is. How is your December going? How is your holiday season going? Whatever holiday you may celebrate. Hanukkah just finished. So if you celebrated Hanukkah, I hope that you had a wonderful 8-night celebration. If you are getting ready for Christmas, I hope that's going well. If you celebrate Yule, that's coming up. If you celebrate Kwanzaa, that's coming up. I hope that all of your preparations are going well and they are what you want them to be. Family, friends, decorating, food, whatever your celebrations look like. I hope you are getting that. So, to today's author interview, we are turning our attention to historical fiction. I am interviewing Bryn Turnbull, and she is the author, as I said, of historical fiction. In this particular case, we are heading to Paris and Champagne, France, during World War II. The book is called The Paris Deception. Let me give you a description of the book. Sophie Dix fled Stuttgart with her brother as the Nazi regime gained power in Germany. Now with her brother gone and her adopted home city of Paris conquered by the Reich, Sophie reluctantly accepts a position restoring damaged art at the Jeu de Paume Museum under the supervision of the ERR, a German art commission using the museum as a repository for art they've looted from Jewish families. Fabienne Brandt was a rising star in the Parisian bohemian arts movement until the Nazis put a stop to so-called degenerate modern art. Still mourning the loss of her firebrand husband, she's resolved to muddle her way through the occupation in whatever way she can, until her estranged sister-in-law, Sophie, arrives at her door with a stolen painting in hand. Soon the two women embark upon a plan to save Paris's degenerates, working beneath the noses of Germany's top art connoisseurs to replace the paintings in the Jeu de Paume with skillful forgeries. But how long can Sophie and Fabienne sustain their masterful illusion? That is a description of The Paris Deception by Bryn Turnbull. You know I love historical fiction. I have read, not as much as is out there, but a lot of historical fiction set in World War II. It's just amazing how many stories and places and people you can create stories around during that time period. And Paris during that time period, I don't know as much about, or I'm learning more about. I've read several books now, but before I started reading historical fiction set in France, and this has been many years, but I mostly knew more, I think, England-centric historical fiction for World War II, and of course some American-centric, since I am American. But I'm always fascinated to read the stories of the occupation or the war or resistance, however it is, in other parts of the world as well. And there are a lot of great books out there where you can learn a lot about what happened in other countries during World War II. This is one of them. I knew about the looting of art from not only Jewish families, but from any families, any people that the Nazis deemed subhuman, not good enough, whatever, however you want to say it. They stole a lot of art, and Bryn talks about that. We'll talk about that in the interview. So it was really interesting to see that even though the characters are fiction, Sophie and Fabienne are fiction, the work that they did, the museum that Sophie works in, all of this was real, and one of the characters is based on a historical figure who really was working with the resistance at this time. So I got to learn lots of interesting information from this book, and we're going to talk about that. So let's go ahead and turn to the interview so Bryn can tell you more about the book and her reasons for writing it, her research, etc. Again, the book is called The Paris Deception. Hi, Bryn. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for being here. I'm excited to talk about your book. It's historical fiction, World War II. But before we do that, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, just a brief introduction so my listeners can get to know you a bit, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Bryn Turnbull. I am an author of historical fiction based in Canada. I'm living currently in snowy Toronto. I've written 3 books. My first was called The Woman Before Wallace. My second is The Last Grand Duchess, about the Romanovs. And my third book, the one that we're here to talk about today, is The Paris Deception.
Yes, and The Paris Deception, like you said, is what we're here to talk about. World War II, Paris, a little bit of the resistance work in Paris at the time. Can you give an overview of the story?
Yeah, absolutely. So The Paris Deception kind of was born out of my interest in the art world during the Second World War, and specifically what happened to the art collections of Jewish families that were murdered in the Holocaust. Now, I knew sort of bits and pieces about the art experience in the Second World War. What I didn't know is that there was a German art commission called the ERR, the Einsatz Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which was responsible for not only stealing all of these art and cultural artifacts from Jewish families all across occupied Europe. They were also responsible for essentially setting up a gallery to bring high-ranking Nazis in, and these Nazis could pick which pieces of art they liked best and send them back to adorn their own walls. So my book, The Paris Deception, takes place in this museum, which is set up as a gallery of sorts by the ERR. It deals with a young woman, Sophie, who's an art restorer who happens to work in this museum. And she realizes what is going on, and she decides to take it upon herself, along with her estranged sister-in-law, to replace these paintings with clever forgeries.
You mentioned that about your interest in finding out what happened to the artwork, which is a lot of it actually is still missing to this day, which is just crazy to me to think about that. So that was kind of your initial jumping off point. But Sophie and Fabienne are fictional characters within this historical fiction world. Can you talk about kind of your inspiration for telling your story, things that actually happened, but from 2 fictional points of view?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there were real life resistance operatives who worked in Paris, worked actually in this very museum the Jeu de Paume to safeguard the collections of Jewish families. But the reason I chose to focus on a fictional character, Sophie, and her sister-in-law, Fabienne, is that I wanted to take a look at a particular sort of subsection of art that was targeted by the Nazis. And it was called, in German parlance, it was called degenerate art. Entartete Kunst. And what this meant is this was art that was not representational. It was modern art. Picasso, Dali, Van Gogh, these are all artists who would have been considered degenerate by the Nazis. And they ended up just prior to the war touring an art exhibition where they'd taken all of these pieces of so-called degenerate art out of public collections across Germany. They toured it across the Reich, and then they piled it up in front of the Reichstag in Berlin and burned it all. So it seemed to me that there was a really sort of compelling parallel to sort of draw about this notion of degenerate art and, these collections of Jewish families who, are also considered in this, twisted ideology to be, to be degenerate themselves. So this was a collection that I wanted to focus on. And in order to do that, I had to kind of place a fictional character very, very close to this artwork. And that's how Sophie kind of came to be.
Yeah, and it's good because you can tell that story, but you might not have as much information about the actual people that were involved in this process. So you can kind of tell the overall story, but with a little leeway.
Yeah, exactly. The resistance operative who worked in the museum was named Rose Valland. And I mean, she is an absolute heroine in every single sense of the word. And initially, when I started writing the book, I toyed with the idea of using Rose as my main character. But the more I kind of started to do the research, the more I started to get into the writing, it became clear that she kind of didn't want to be the main character. She wanted to sort of have this backseat role, which kind of was an interesting thing because people did not know that she was a resistance operative. And nor does Sophie in this book, which sets up a very interesting dynamic between the two of them.
We are going to take our first break of this episode, but keep Rose in mind because we are going to talk a little bit more about her when we come back. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Bryn Turnbull. We are talking, of course, about her historical fiction novel, The Paris Deception. Before the break, we were talking about a character in the novel who is also a historical character named Rose, who was with the resistance during World War II. And so I said, keep that in mind because we are going to bring that back up, which we are going to now as we go back into that conversation. Yeah, it's almost as though the real person kind of came through what you were writing. It was like, nope, I was in the background in real life. I don't want to be in the foreground in this book either.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds kind of silly to say, but I find it very true. When you're writing historical characters, there comes a point where you've done all the research and you start to write and they start kind of talking back to you. And yes. They tell you what they want. They tell you how they want to be portrayed in the book. It's a very weird process.
Yes, every time authors talk about their characters, telling them exactly where their arc is going, I always think that's crazy, but it happens to so many people. It has to be accurate.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. So, so those two main characters of Sophie and Fabienne, the story is told from both of their points of view. So can you talk a little bit more about them as characters and what about them is going to resonate with readers?
Yeah. So Sophie is a young woman. She is actually concealing a rather important secret, which is that she is German by birth. And she and her older brother, Dietrich, in the 1930s, having grown up in this, ideologically restrictive Hitler Youth kind of environment, they see what's happening in Germany and they don't agree with it. And so they end up in Paris, which is, of course, much more to their liking and much more ideologically aligned to who they are as individuals. And so Sophie, when the Germans come in, she thinks that she's left this world behind her. But of course, when the Nazis invade France, that world that she left behind comes back in a very horrible way. Her brother Dietrich is a very prominent character in this book, even though he is no longer alive when the book begins, because he marries Fabienne, who's my other main character. And Fabienne is a young bohemian artist. She's very much an artist in the sense of this degenerate art that the Nazis hated. And she's a young socialist firebrand who has sort of this very deep wound at her heart, which is, of course, that her husband Dietrich has passed away. He gets murdered. This is not really a spoiler or anything, but he gets murdered just prior to the Nazi invasion. And so these two characters, I didn't want them to be friends at the start of the book. I thought it was more interesting to set them up kind of as not really antagonists, but as characters with a deep love, but a deep grief right at the heart of who they are. And they end up having to work together kind of by necessity and learning to trust each other again.
And they have interesting parallels because they go about their experiences during the war, their day-to-day lives during the war in very different ways, and they kind of don't approve of the other one. But objectively, they're doing a lot of the same things, just from different points of view.
Yeah, very much so. I when I started writing this book, I really wanted to look at what was the experience for the average Parisian during the Second World War, because we all look at it with the benefit of hindsight and with the benefit of, history behind us. And we all say, of course we would resist. Of course we would know what we would do. Of course we would stand up from the get-go. But the reality is that isn't what happened. 90% of people in Paris just were trying to get along. And so what does that look like? What does resistance look like if you can't join the resistance, the capital R resistance operating and blowing up train lines? And, what does resistance look like on a very, very, very individual level? And so that's kind of what I wanted to see through these characters' eyes. And then also, of course, what does collaboration look like? Because there was no guarantee that the Allies were going to win the war. So how do you go along with your daily life? How do you build a daily life during an occupation where you don't know if that's ever going to end? What are the choices that you make?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it is crazy to think, because we do come at it from our own perspective. We know that the war is going to end, that the Allies are going to come in and liberate France, etc. But people then did not. And I would imagine that maybe some readers, but certainly people living at the time might not see what Sophie and Fabienne are doing as that important in terms of like overall resistance. But it's A, what they know, B, what they can do, and C, actually very important in, just in that preserving of culture and art and beauty.
Yeah. I mean, and as you said, sort of at the top of our conversation, this is an issue that still is ongoing today. There are still, I think the number is 100,000 works of art that were looted by the Germans in the Second World War that are still not accounted for. And these are works of art that belong to the descendants of their original owners, of these Jewish families. And so it is still very much a problem, and it's still very much an issue that is affecting the art world and the descendants of survivors and those who perished. It's still very much affecting them today.
That number is mind-boggling. I mean, that's what's left. The amount that was stolen in the first place, just every time I think about it, is incredible.
Yeah, they estimate that the Nazis stole 20% of all of the art in Europe during this war.
Yeah, wow. So can you talk a little bit about writing from these two different points of view? Were there any particular challenges in writing it that way? Or, I mean, it definitely tells the story from multiple points, but just talk about the writing experiences and, any successes or challenges that you experienced.
Well, this is my first book that has two main protagonists and, two narrators. So that was an interesting challenge, just in the sense of trying to kind of jump from one voice to another. I know a lot of writers who are able to write an entire book from one character's perspective and then the entire book again from the second character's perspective and then knit them together. My brain does not work that way. That is too many spinning plates. For me, I tend to write linearly. So that means jumping back and forth between each character's voices every chapter, which of course has its own challenges, because say a chapter takes sort of a few days to write, you have to think back to, okay, well, what were we talking about the last time that we caught up with Sophie? What was in her mind? What are the things that are propelling her at this particular moment in the story? So I found that very challenging, but also very rewarding, being able to kind of thread in the different experiences of different characters so intimately. Sophie and Fabienne, I look at them as two sides of the same coin. One's German, one's French, one is one is gay, one is straight, one is introverted, one is extroverted. And so to kind of be able to play with those dynamics was really, really interesting. Just in terms of, from an artistic perspective and from a creative perspective.
Did you use any particular tools to help keep everything straight for yourself?
Scrivener.
Okay.
I love Scrivener. That's my absolute favorite.
Do you consider yourself more of a plotter or a pantser or a plantser?
I am definitely a plotter. I think in historical fiction, I would find it very, very difficult to write historical fiction without having that sort of undergrounding of the plot there. And particularly, a book like this, which is kind of a historical thriller in a sense. I need to know all of the machinations. I need to know kind of where all the trapdoors are in the story, so to speak, in order to get it kind of to the finish line. I also find I have to do so much research ahead of time into the time and place, what's going on politically, socially, culturally, economically, what's happening in Paris and then in Champagne, which is sort of a secondary plot in the story, and then what's happening in Germany pre-war, all of these things. If I was doing that by the seat of my pants, I don't think I could. I think I'd collapse.
Makes sense to me. Yes, I'm always fascinated by people who are just pure pantsers, and they kind of know where the story is going to end up, and how they get there is even a mystery to them. So
it's like alchemy. It's magic.
Yeah, it's something. Yeah, it's amazing.
I consider myself like a plotter with 2 Ds, right? Like it's just get from one chapter to the next and know what's happening.
Yes. It is time for our second break of this episode. I do sometimes wonder, if I were to actually write a novel of some sort, would I be a plotter or a pantser? Would I be a plantser? I feel like I'm fascinated by pantsers because I can't imagine writing with no plan. But then I know myself, and I would start to write an outline and then I'd get sidetracked. I don't know. I think I'd be a plantser. I think I'd have good intentions, and then those intentions would just go out the window. But I don't know. I always like hearing how authors go about crafting their stories and know where it's going and how they keep track of things. So it's fascinating to me. Anyway, When we come back, we will be talking a little bit more about the characters in this story and the way Bryn develops those characters. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Bryn Turnbull. We are talking about her historical fiction novel, The Paris Deception. Let's return now to that conversation. So I assume then, as a plotter, you are you probably have a pretty good understanding of your characters before you start writing, but of course they can surprise you. So how much leeway do you give characters to kind of develop as you're writing?
I think you always have to give characters a bit of leeway. You always kind of have to allow them the ability to grow as you write. Because I mean, human beings aren't static. We change every day. And we have to be able to kind of afford that to our characters as well, particularly when you consider the fact that most books take place kind of in a character's very heightened moment of drama, very heightened moment of, personal conflict. So I'm always interested to see kind of how the character develops from the starting point that I give them. Like, I know their whole backstory, that I develop the backstory for each of the characters. I know their childhood traumas. I know where they grew up. I know what they did in their spare time, and all of that kind of feeds into when I set them on the page and say, run, feeds into that, like, okay, what are the observations that they're going to make that would be different from mine, and different from each other's, and that's kind of fun. I really enjoy that whole process. But yeah, definitely a lot of preliminary work goes into getting them to page one, I'd say.
And as part of that, as well as preparing to write, historical fiction requires so much research, a fraction of which actually shows up on the page. But was there any particular research that you did that was surprising, or, just sent you down a massive rabbit hole? Talk a little bit about the research.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that really kind of chilled me in the research process was looking into the experience of young people growing up in the 1930s in Germany, and the level of indoctrination that they endured from the time that they're 2, 3, 4 years old. Sophie and Fabienne experienced that. They're slightly older when Hitler comes to power. They're in their teens, but they get kind of drafted into, for Dietrich, the Hitler Youth, and for Sophie, the BDM, which was the female equivalent of the Hitler Youth. And just the experiences of what these people went through, and particularly young girls who were very much seen as essentially breeders for the war machine, was really very, very, very chilling. And kind of when I came across that in the research, I knew that I wanted to explore it in a certain way. I knew that I wanted to kind of look at the pain that was inflicted upon these children from a very early age. So that was definitely like a big, deep, dark kind of research period for me in writing this book. One that was a little lighter was actually the Champagne region and what happened in Champagne during the Second World War. I needed a place in the book for my characters to hide all of this art that they start stealing out of the museum. And I kind of settled on the notion of Champagne because basically I wanted to have an excuse to go do a research trip in the Champagne region. And Champagne, pardon me?
I said, makes sense. I mean,
of course, absolutely.
Oh gosh, you have to go to the Champagne region of France to do research. I'm so sorry.
Darn, the things I do for my readers, right?
Yeah.
But, it turns out Champagne has this unbelievably remarkable history of resistance that I really knew nothing about, and kind of being able to look into that and into the heroism of Champagne and resistance. There's a great book. It's called War and Wine by, gosh, I'm going to butcher the name, Donnie and Petey Cladstrup, I think are the names of the authors. And it goes into what happened in Champagne during the Second World War, and kind of to just be able to put like a little snippet of that on the page was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I bet. It sounds like it. And earlier when you were talking about that rabbit hole of what happened in the 30s, we so often think of World War II as just that period in the 40s, when it really was a world war. It's easy to maybe not forget, but not always be as aware of everything that led up to it, and living there and experiencing that, and just the amount of indoctrination that was happening is, I can imagine you would be stuck in that rabbit hole for a long time, because even the little bits that I've read and delved into are just mind blowing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, fascism doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? It doesn't crop up overnight. And, there were many, many, many steps along the way for Germany that led to 1940.
Absolutely. Yes. So what about historical fiction draws you to writing within that genre?
Oh, well, I mean, it's always been my favorite genre to read. I absolutely love it. I love being able to learn about different time periods and about, the experiences of other people in that historical context. And I think as a writer, the thing that really draws me to it is the fact that, the historical record often leaves women out. It leaves out women, it leaves out marginalized voices, it leaves out people of color, LGBTQ characters. And so historical fiction, I really feel, is a way for us to write these people back into the record where they belonged all along. I think that's one of the reasons that historical fiction is such like a female driven genre, is because, for the vast majority of recorded history, certainly in the Western world, the victors wrote the record, and those victors were always men. So women's stories have not been really kind of given their due. So being able to kind of go in and find these stories and sort of share an experience of what these women in the past might have, how they might have lived, I think is just such a privilege to be able to do that.
Yeah. And I've talked to so many people who think that I've always loved history. I've always loved historical fiction. I was a history major in college, but I talked to so many people who think that history is just so boring. And on the one hand, I get it. There's some really terrible texts out there that are just dry, but I think that's where historical fiction can really help, because it's written in such a way that you are still learning about a period, and you're learning about the people in that period, not just dates and
not
wars.
Just white men.
Yeah, exactly. So what are you working on currently?
Yeah, I am on tenterhooks because I'm supposed to be getting my edits back in the next couple of days. My next book actually goes into Germany in the post-war period. It's called The Berlin Apartment. It's coming out next autumn. And it's about a young couple who get engaged in August 1961 in Berlin, and they spend 2 nights apart, and on those 2 nights that they're apart, the Berlin Wall goes up between them. And so of the premise of the book is it's about this couple. They're meant to be together. They are, destined for each other. But what happens when circumstance and politics and sort of just living in this vast historical moment keeps you apart for decades. So really, really fun. It's, a story of love and betrayal, and I love the story. I fell so in love with the characters while I was writing them.
Only a historical fiction writer could describe what you just described, separated for decades, and then say really, really fun. I love that.
Yeah. Because you think about it, and now we have so many ways to communicate with each other. We have so many ways to keep in, but it was very hard. You'd be living a block apart. It's putting a wall up down Wall Street in New York, right? And you don't have phones. You can't communicate across the wall the way that we do now. And I mean, this is all very much living memory, which is just wild to think about.
Yeah. And even without a wall between us, people did not travel, 15 minutes away. And you might not see those people for 5 to 10 years at a time.
Yeah. I mean, entire families, there are these heartbreaking images when the wall went up of people, coming to a window where they could be seen across the wall because they'd just gotten married and they were never going to see their parents again, or, holding their children up across the wall so that relatives could see them, before the wall got higher and bigger and more insurmountable. It's quite something. And the lengths people went to reunite, tunnels dug underneath the walls. People, there was one man who built a hot air balloon to try and fly over the wall to get out of East Germany. And I mean, you think about that, it's just remarkable what human, the lengths of ingenuity people will go to for freedom.
It is time for our final break of this episode. When we come back, Bryn will be talking about the first 2 historical fiction novels she wrote. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with Bryn Turnbull. Before the break, Bryn was talking about the new book that she is working on, and part of that story involves the fact that a couple gets married, and then before they can begin their life together, the Berlin Wall goes up, separating them. And so just wanted to remind you of that conversation because we are picking it up here in the next comment. Let's return to that interview. It's also crazy because I remember when the wall came down. But my nieces were never alive in that. They didn't exist in their lifetime. So it's fast. That's why I love historical fiction and just everything that goes into learning about those different time periods.
Yeah, me too. I love it. Any historical book, any historical time period.
Third historical fiction novel. Do you want to talk about the first 2 at all?
Yeah, for sure. My first book, it's called The Woman Before Wallace, and it is about, it's basically a precursor to The Crown. You could kind of call it. It's about a woman. Her name was Thelma Furness. True story. She was mistress to Edward VIII, the Prince of Wales, as he was back then, in the 1930s. And she had a very good friend named Wallace Simpson. And the reason Edward and Wallace got together, and the reason the abdication crisis happened, and the reason that Elizabeth II ascended to the throne is all because Thelma had to leave Edward for a period of about 6 weeks in the early 1930s. She takes Wallace Simpson out for lunch to the Ritz Hotel and tells her Edward's going to be very lonely without me. Will you look after him while I'm gone? And she comes back, and Wallace has done a bit too good of a job looking after Edward. So, yeah. So, I mean, you know, I loved this character in this story. Thelma not only was involved with British royalty through Edward, but also she was very, very close to American royalty, so to speak, because her twin sister, Gloria, married into the Vanderbilt family. And the reason Thelma had to leave Edward in 1934 was because her sister Gloria was being dragged through the courts in kind of the first big celebrity court case in history, which was known as the matter of Vanderbilt, over her daughter, little Gloria Vanderbilt, you know, known now as the artist and the fashion designer. And so Thelma had to go and support her sister in this custody battle. And so I couldn't believe this character. She was so interesting. She was kind of adjacent to all of these major historical moments. And she kind of had only ever really been seen as a footnote. So yeah, that's book one. That's The Woman Before Wallace. And then my second novel, The Last Grand Duchess, is about the fall of the Romanov dynasty as experienced and as witnessed through the eyes of Nicholas and Alexander's eldest daughter, Olga. And Olga was a young woman. She was 23 years old when she was murdered in 1918. She had worked as a Red Cross nurse during the First World War. And when Rasputin was murdered in 1917, her sort of reaction was, I understand why they did it, which I thought was just such an interesting thing, because all I had really known about the Romanovs up to that point, particularly the Romanov girls, the daughters, was that they were these very sheltered young women. And yet here's Olga, who actually had quite an astute mind and was quite heavily involved in the abdication of her father. So yeah, that's my second novel, The Last Grand Duchess. And yeah, then I moved on to The Paris Deception. Now I'm going to Germany, and I'm kind of just making my way through Europe.
Sounds good to me. In terms of writing for publication, is that something that you always wanted to do? Did you come to that decision later in life? How did that look for you?
Oh, I tried very hard not to. I resisted the call to write for publication for quite some time. I didn't see it as a viable career option. And, you know, it's a very lonely and often soul crushing, experience. But what ended up happening, I worked in communications. I kind of pushed against writing for anybody other than myself for a long time, until I came across Thelma, and I came across her story, and I kind of couldn't get her out of my head. It got to the point where I would be at my office, at my comms job, thinking about Thelma more than I was thinking about like the work that I was being paid to do there. So that for me was kind of a sign. And I left that job. I ended up going and doing a degree in creative writing at the University of St. Andrews, thinking to myself, even if it doesn't work out, even if I don't get published, I'll have something to show for it on my resume when I go back to the corporate world. And yeah, it kind of has just snowballed from there. I've had, I won't pretend that I haven't worked hard. I have worked hard, but I've had a very lucky, career trajectory, I would say. I feel very fortunate to have had the experiences that I've had as an author.
I love that it was Thelma that brought you there, because again, she's not very well known, but she's so very interconnected, and she brought you to the publishing world. So one more thing. Perfect.
Opening another door. That's my Thelma.
Absolutely. From your experience, do you have advice for someone thinking they might want to write historical fiction?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing is take all of the notes, like do not just put it all in your head and leave it there. Take all of the notes on all of your sources, on all of your research, because the number of times where I've had to go back into the annals of my dusty little brain and think, where was that one little piece of information, is just the absolute worst. So I would say, like, copious notes. Do the research, because you're never going to get it 100% right. There's no such thing as 100% right in any work of art. But, do the research and really engage with the historical time period, because if you're not engaging with it, if you're just putting your characters into that time and place because you love the costumes or the setting, that's not a good enough reason. They have to kind of interact with the world around them, and they have to be kind of shaped by the world around them. So I'd say really enjoy that process, because it is a lot of fun to be able to create those characters. Thirdly, like your characters. You spend a lot of time with them. Even when you're not at your desk writing, they're in the back of your head chirping away. So make sure that you enjoy spending time with your characters, because you spend a lot more time with them than you think you will.
For sure. Yeah, if you don't like them, probably your readers won't either.
Yep.
You mentioned that historical fiction is one of your favorite genres to read. So other favorite genres and favorite authors when you're reading just for you?
Oh, when I'm reading just for me, well, I love, Kate Quinn, of course, my absolute favorite historical fiction author. She's just absolutely wonderful. I've read, I just finished Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet, which I thought was a really, really interesting work, again, of historical fiction. When I'm not reading historical fiction, I love Neil Gaiman. He's one of my favorite authors of all time. I have read pretty much everything he's ever written. And I love that he writes across genres, which is really, really, really fun. And then in terms of wonderful, luscious beach reads that you can really sink your teeth into, Carly Fortune is just at the absolute top of her game. Her most recent novel was just thrilling, so much fun. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Those are my top at the moment.
Appreciate it. How about internet presence, website, and any social media where people can find you in case they want to learn more about you or interact a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm most active on Instagram. My handle is Bryn Turnbull Writes. You can also find me on my website, brynturnbull.com. I find, because I love doing the research so much, my website has kind of a whole bunch of sort of research and historical portals on it into the different books and into the different kind of characters and timelines and everything, because I need to put it somewhere, and I'm lucky enough to have a website where I can do all that. Yeah, I'd say those are the main ones. I am also on Facebook. I do update Facebook. That's Bryn Turnbull Author. And yeah, the other one's not quite so much. Those are my mains.
Okay, perfect. Well, Bryn, we've talked about a few different things during our time together, but is there anything that we haven't touched on that you were hoping to highlight?
Thank you so much for having me on. This has just been an absolute pleasure. Getting to chat about all things historical fiction is my absolute favorite, but also, as a writer, you spend a lot of time on your own in your own head. And so being able to kind of talk to people and it's very nice. So thank you for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, not only about the Paris Deception, but writing in general. I really appreciate it. It's been great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you once again to Bryn for joining me to talk about all of her writings, but especially the Paris Deception, and for having a great conversation. I really appreciate it. As always, love having authors on the podcast. We're getting closer to when it's not enough time to buy presents for the holidays, but you don't have to have a reason to buy a book, especially one where you can learn something. So historical fiction books are great for learning about a time period or a place or people that you might not have known something about. So if you are at all a fan of historical fiction, I definitely encourage you to check out The Paris Deception, maybe some of Bryn's other books as well, and buy it for yourself for a late Christmas present or a New Year's present, whatever. I'll find a reason for you to buy a book. Just ask me. I'll make up holiday for you. But thank you to Bryn, and definitely check out this book if you are interested in historical fiction, in Paris, in World War II, etc. I hope you'll join me for the next episode when we have a returning author. If all goes well, no scheduling snafus. Returning author Allison Levy will be joining me to talk about the first book in a new series that she is working on. We're going to fantasy this time, so the main character is a witch, and we'll be hearing more about that book when Allison joins me. So hopefully you will join us as well for that conversation. In the meantime, as always, if you're a fan of this podcast and want to help in any way, there are several things you can do to get the podcast out to more listeners. First, of course, you can like, subscribe, follow on whatever platform you listen to the podcast on. That way you'll always get new episodes when they come out. You won't have to guess about scheduling snafus. You'll know when there's a new episode out. You can also leave a review on those platforms, written or starred. Great, wonderful, very helpful. Doesn't have to be complicated. Any kind of review helps the podcast get more listeners. And then finally, you can follow the podcast on social media. As you know, come find the podcast and me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Let me know what you've been up to, especially what you've been reading, what you want to read in 2024. What are your 2024 reading goals? I'd love to hear. As always, I hope you've had a wonderful week, and as always, I hope that week has given you plenty of time, even in this busy holiday season, to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.